The first sign that something was wrong was the smell. Marceline Voss noticed it 3 hours into her shift at the radiation monitoring station on Deck 7. A faint copper tang that shouldn't have been there, riding the recycled air like a memory of blood. She checked the atmospheric scrubbers, all nominal. She checked the rad counters along the outer hull corridor, normal. She pulled up the logs from the isotope storage array on the colony ship's lower decks and stared at them for a long time, the way you stare at a document you've read 4 times and still can't parse. She almost called it in. Then the readings normalized and she told herself she was tired, and she went back to her coffee. She would think about that decision for the rest of her life. The colony ship Perseverance had been in transit for 19 months when the crew started going strange. Not violently, nothing dramatic. It was quiet, the way a fire starts quiet, just warmth in a wall somewhere, invisible and patient. Lieutenant Okonkwo began leaving his meals untouched. Dr. Fassbender missed a shift briefing and was found in the starboard observation bay, standing at the glass, watching the dark. When asked what he was looking at, he said, "Everything." When asked what he meant, he smiled in a way that didn't reach any part of his face that smiling was supposed to reach, and said he wasn't sure anymore. Commander Idris Suleiman logged the incidents methodically and without alarm. He had been selected for this mission precisely because his psychological profile showed an almost architectural resistance to panic. He had the face of a man who had considered catastrophe from every angle and simply decided it wasn't worth the energy. He was 44 years old, a structural engineer by original training, a deep space commander by a series of decisions that had seemed small at the time. He wore the same expression whether he was reading poetry or damage reports, which was a quality his crew found either reassuring or deeply unnerving, depending on how well they knew him. He called Dr. Marceline Voss into his office on the morning of the 22nd incident. This time, one of the cargo handlers had simply sat down in the middle of a corridor and refused to move, not aggressively, not in distress, just sat there with his hands in his lap like a man waiting for a bus, and he asked her what she thought was happening. She put a data pad on his desk. On it were 17 months of radiation readings from the isotope storage array in the lower decks. She had gone back and pulled every log after the copper smell, and then gone back further still, and then further, and what she found was this: a gradient. A slow, almost imperceptible climb in low-frequency magnetic emissions from the storage containers, so gradual that the automated systems had flagged nothing because nothing had crossed a threshold. But it was there. It had been building since month 2. Magnetic resonance at that frequency, she said, in prolonged low-level exposure, affects neural consolidation, memory integration, the boundary between waking and dreaming cognition. Suleiman looked at the numbers for a long time. So they're not going mad. They're going permeable, she said. The walls between what's real and what the brain generates are getting thinner. Some people, it just feels like déjà vu. Some people, it's visions. Some people, it stops being a boundary at all. He was quiet. Outside the porthole, the stars held their positions with their usual indifference. "How many people are in early-stage exposure?" he asked. She told him, 83, out of a crew of 311. He sat with that number, the way you sit with a number that means something. Then he asked about the storage array, and she told him about the cascade risk. And his expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. Something that looked like a man doing very fast arithmetic and not liking the sum. "Fix it," he said. She tried. The problem with nuclear isotope containers that have been slowly heating for 17 months is that they don't fix cleanly. You can cool them and stabilize them and cycle the magnetic baffles and think you've solved it. And then at 0340 station time, in the quiet hour before the early shift, something deep in the chain decides it's done waiting. Marceline was in the storage corridor when it started. She felt it first in her teeth. A vibration so low it was more of a pressure, like the whole ship was exhaling. Then the lights went amber. Then the first containment unit's pressure gauge spiked into the red, and she had approximately 4 seconds to decide whether to try to manually seal the cascade valve or to run. She ran. She was not ashamed of this. Behind her, the first unit discharged. The sound it made was not like an explosion. It was too deep for that. More like a chord played on an instrument the size of a building, felt more than heard, and the corridor walls flexed visibly, and she was thrown sideways into the railing and grabbed it and held on. Then the second unit went, then the third. And then all of them at once, a chain that had been inevitable for 17 months, and the entire aft section of the Perseverance became a pillar of thrust. The ship didn't explode. It did something almost worse. It decelerated, catastrophically, violently. The kind of deceleration that turns physics into a personal problem. 311 people were pinned to the floor, to walls, to ceilings, to each other, as the ship's velocity shed in seconds what it had taken months to build. Suleiman, in his command chair, with his restraints locked, watched the navigation display show their trajectory change like a line being drawn by a hand that did not care about them. The engine telemetry was a cascade of red. The isotope array was gone. The thrust that had torn them from their flight path was dissipating into cold space. And when the ship finally stopped shaking, they were no longer where they were supposed to be. They were somewhere else entirely. And the sensors were showing them they were not alone. The object that appeared on their screens was not a ship. Or rather, it was not only a ship. It occupied space the way a city occupies a hill, with mass and confidence and the clear assumption that everything around it existed in relation to it. It was larger than the Perseverance by an order of magnitude that made the comparison feel rude. It was dark. It was geometric in ways that didn't quite resolve into shapes the eye wanted to follow. It did not respond to any of their hailing frequencies. Suleiman ordered weapons to stand by. He was not a violent man, but he was a precise one, and precision included being ready. Then the hallucination started. Not for everyone, just for the 83 who had been longest in the magnetic field. They began seeing things that weren't there, or things that were there but not visible. The cargo handler who had sat in the corridor said later that he had seen a city the color of bone, towers without windows, a sky the wrong shade of blue, and in the city, figures moving with a slow deliberateness that felt like they were thinking in a different unit of time. Dr. Fassbender, who had been standing at the observation bay for hours, began writing in his log with frantic intensity and wouldn't stop. What he was writing was coordinates. Correct coordinates. Coordinates that matched the object on their sensors precisely, down to the decimal point. And he had no access to the navigation system, and he had written the first entry 6 hours before the object appeared. Suleiman read the log and felt something shift in the architecture of his certainty. He was not a man who believed in the supernatural. He believed in information he didn't yet have, which was different. He went to the observation bay and stood beside Fassbender and looked at the object and waited. What came next happened to everyone. Not a sound. A presence. Something that settled into the back of the skull the way cold settles into a room, not from one direction, but everywhere at once. And in that presence, a communication that was not in words, but had the structure of words, the weight of intent, the syntax of a verdict. You are known to us. You have been known to us for some time. You are the species that burns. You are the species that carries its own destruction in its hands and cannot put it down. You are the plague that walks upright and calls itself civilization. You have no place in what lies ahead. Suleiman, to his credit, did not reach for the weapons console. He reached for the communications array instead. He opened every frequency they had. He spoke into them in English and in the 3 other languages he knew, and he said, very carefully, "We hear you. We're listening. Tell us what we did wrong." There was a silence. It was not an empty silence. Then, you know what you did. You carry it in your hull. You carry it in your cells. You burn your own world, and then you bring the burning here. Suleiman sat with that for a moment. He had a habit, in difficult conversations, of threading his wedding ring around his finger, not nervously, just as something for his hands to do while his brain worked. He did it now. "You're not wrong," he said. "About the burning. We do that. We've always done that. But I'm curious, how long have you been watching us?" The answer came back not in numbers but in images, and the images were long. A geological kind of long. Civilizations that had risen and fallen on Earth like tides. Species that had come and gone. And through it all, humanity, small and persistent and constantly, endlessly making fire where it should not. "Then you know," Suleiman said, "that we also put fires out. No response. You've watched long enough to see us burn. Have you watched long enough to see us mourn what we burned? We built those storage containers because we were trying to clean up something we'd already done wrong. We were trying to fix it. That's why we're here, drifting in your territory, because we were trying to do better, and we failed. And the failure hurt us more than it hurt anyone else." He paused. "I don't know if that matters to you, but it's true." The presence in the room shifted. It was still there, but its quality changed. It became less like a verdict and more like a consideration. And then the warships appeared. They came from the body of the alien vessel in silence, 3 of them, the geometry of their hulls wrong in ways that made the eyes slide away. They were not moving toward the Perseverance. They were surrounding it. The crew went very still. Suleiman kept his hands visible. He had learned, a long time ago, that the most important thing you could communicate across a gap of any kind was intention, and intention lived in the body before it lived in words. He spread his hands flat on the console in front of him, palms down, and said, "We're not going to fire. Even if you fire first, we're going to try to talk first, because that's the only thing we have left to try." Lieutenant Okonkwo, at the weapons station, looked at the commander for a long moment. Then he took his hands off the weapons console and put them in his lap. One by one, quietly, the crew followed suit. The warships held their positions. Marceline Voss was in the medical bay, treating a burn on her forearm from the corridor railing, when she felt the presence shift a second time. She was not one of the 83. She had spent less time in the magnetic field, but it touched her anyway, lighter, like a question rather than a statement. She looked up from the burn and said, to the empty room, "They're afraid of us." The presence confirmed nothing, but it didn't leave. "That's what this is," she said. She was talking to herself, but she wasn't. All of this, the projections, the fear weapons, the verdict. You've been watching us for so long, and everything you've watched has been the worst of us. You saw the burning, and you concluded that's all we are. You never waited to see what we do after. She thought about the 83. She thought about Fassbender writing coordinates in a fugue state, his subconscious reaching towards something his waking mind couldn't process. She thought about what that meant, that at some level, when the walls got thin enough, human minds reached out. Not toward weapons, toward the unknown. "We're curious," she said. "Even when we're terrified, we're curious. That's the thing you missed. We don't go into the dark because we're not afraid of it. We go because we are afraid, and we go anyway. That's all we've ever done." In the command bay, one of the warships powered down its weapons array. Then the second. The third took longer, but it came. The communication that followed was not easy or clean or triumphant. It was slow and strange and full of long silences that felt like 2 different kinds of thinking trying to find a shared room. The aliens, who did not have a name for themselves in any frequency that human vocal apparatus could produce, so the crew eventually and without ceremony called them the Watchers, were ancient in a way that made the word ancient feel inadequate. They had watched humanity from the beginning. They had concluded, based on all available evidence, that humanity was a terminal case, brilliant, creative, incandescent, and irreversibly self-destructive. They had been wrong before. Not often, but before. Commander Suleiman spent 11 hours in negotiation with a presence that could be anywhere in a room at once and had no face to read. He was exhausted in a way that went past the body. He kept threading his wedding ring. He told them about the storage containers. He told them about the probe they had been carrying. A biological survey kit, seeds, and soil samples, the small ambitions of a species that wanted to grow things somewhere new. He told them about the woman who had been pregnant when they launched and was now a mother, and about the child who had been born in transit and had never seen Earth and had no memory of it, and was therefore, in some fundamental sense, already a creature of the dark between stars. He told them, toward the end, about a cave in the south of France where human hands had pressed themselves into stone 50,000 years ago, leaving outlines, not drawings, not symbols, just the shape of a hand, a declaration that said, I was here, and I had hands, and I pressed them against the world to leave a mark." He wasn't sure why he told them that. It seemed important. The Watchers were quiet for a very long time after. What they offered was not welcome. It wasn't absolution or alliance or open arms. It was closer to a stay of execution and a question. The question was whether humanity could be what it sometimes, briefly, appeared capable of being, or whether the burning was all there was. Suleiman said he didn't know. He said that was probably the most honest thing a human being could say. He said they were going to try anyway. The warships withdrew. In the quiet that followed, Marceline treated the last of the injured from the deceleration. Okonkwo ate something for the first time in 3 days. Fassbender's log entries, reread in daylight, turned out to be not coordinates but poems. Or not poems exactly, but something with the structure of poems, attempts to put into language the shapes the presence had left in him. He was embarrassed by this and tried to delete them. Suleiman told him not to. "That's evidence," Suleiman said. "Of what?" "That something happened. That we touched something and it touched us back, and neither one of us is exactly what we were before. That's worth keeping. Fassbender looked at the entries for a long time. They think we're a plague. They thought, Suleiman said. Past tense. What changed their minds? Suleiman was quiet for a moment. Outside the porthole, the alien vessel was withdrawing into the dark, huge and unhurried, and already the stars around it looked different. Not because they had changed, but because the humans looking at them had. I don't think we changed their minds, he said finally. I think we made them uncertain. And for something that ancient uncertainty is. He paused, searching for the right word. It's significant. The repairs took 4 months. The isotope array was gone, which meant the Perseverance couldn't complete its original mission. The planet they had been headed for was unreachable without the drive system the array had powered. They used what remained of their fuel budget to achieve a stable orbit around a moon in the system where the accident had thrown them, and they sent a long transmission back toward Earth that would take years to arrive, and they waited. They were not alone while they waited. The Watchers did not make contact again in any direct way, but the 83, the crew members whose neural architecture had been reshaped by the months of magnetic exposure, began to notice things. Not visions anymore, not the bone-colored cities and the wrong blue skies, something quieter. The sense that something vast was paying attention, not warmly, not coldly, the way you pay attention to something you haven't decided about yet. Okonkwo said it felt like being watched by someone who was still making up their mind. Marceline said, that's fine. We can work with undecided. She meant it. She had learned, in the corridor when the cascade began, that running was not cowardice. It was information. It told you where you were, and where they were now was here, in orbit around an unknown moon, in a solar system they had reached by catastrophe, watched by something ancient and uncertain, with seeds in their hold and a child who had never seen Earth, and a commander who kept threading his wedding ring in the quiet moments and looking at the stars, like he was trying to read something written in a language he almost knew. The colony they eventually built was small and practical and took years longer than anyone had planned. It was built in a crater, sheltered from radiation, with habitat rings and solar collectors and a greenhouse module that Fassbender eventually ran because he said the plants didn't ask him to explain his poems. They named the colony after what had brought them here, not the disaster, not the ship, not the mission. They named it after the one thing that had saved them. The moment in the dark when every person on the bridge had taken their hands off the weapons console and placed them in their laps, palms up, and waited. They called it restraint. Years later, when the first resupply ship found them, following the long transmission, following the coordinates that Fassbender had written in a fugue state and never quite understood, the pilot of the resupply ship came in on approach and asked over the radio what it was like, what the colony was like, what the people were like. Marceline answered. She was on comm duty. She had been on the ship for 19 months and then in orbit for another 4 years. And she had helped build every structure in restraint from the foundations up, and her hands were rougher than they used to be. And she was, by any objective measure, one of the people most changed by what had happened. She thought about the Watchers. She thought about the verdict that had been a death sentence and had become, eventually, a question. She thought about the child, born in transit, who was now 5 years old, and had never seen Earth, and had no fear of the dark because she had been born in it, and it was simply the medium she moved through, and who had asked Marceline once, with 5-year-old directness, whether the shapes in the Watcher's signal were scary or just different. Marceline had thought about it for a while before answering. Then she'd said, mostly different. The child had accepted this immediately. Of course, it was just information. What's it like? Marceline said into the radio. Through the observation port of the comm station, she could see the colony below, the crater's edge, the solar arrays like outstretched hands, the greenhouse dome where Fassbender's plants grew in the slow, patient way of things that had no idea they weren't supposed to be here. It's home, she said. Give us a few years, it'll look like we were always here. The resupply pilot laughed a little. From 100 kilometers up, looking at the construction, the crater, at the lights moving in patterns that meant people living their lives, she said she thought she could already see that. Somewhere in the dark beyond the system's edge, something vast continued to watch. The question remained open. Humanity continued to be the answer it always had been. Incomplete, imperfect, still burning in some places, still pressing its hands against stone in others. Still sending ships into the dark, with seeds in the hold, and a child in the cradle, and a commander with a wedding ring, and a doctor who ran toward the sound, and then ran away, and then came back. Still, against all evidence and prior conviction, trying,